Have you ever heard the sound a scalpel makes as it slides over bone? If you haven't, it's a little like a knife scraping over a hollow rock. The bone isn't as solid as you might think, not as solid as the blade at least, and the sound has an eerie quality to it. The more I reflect on the sound, the more it reminds me of nails on a chalkboard or sidewalk chalk that kids drag over pavement. It's a weird noise that sets your hair on edge, makes you grit your teeth against the intrusive grinding. I've had a lot of time to think about that sound in the years following my wife's death. That was the sound that woke me up that night. It had been a long week. The department had been reeling over a series of brutal murders, and this was the first night I'd gotten to sleep in my own bed. I had been crashing in the break room, sleeping in my car, living one cup of coffee at a time while we tried to catch this sadistic son of a bitch. I know many cops in the same situation, but as most of us are locals, the desire to see this guy brought to justice was palpable. The killer had been sticking to a specific area. My area, actually. He was killing with no pattern, no particular demographic, but he seemed to be sticking to victims in this particular part of town. They were low to middle income families, people who couldn't just afford to up and leave because a crazy killer was on the loose, no matter how heinous the crimes were. And the crimes were particularly heinous. 7 different victims, none of them having anything in common, had been found with their faces skinned down to the bone and removed. The whole face. It was as though someone had cut the face off, skinned it to the skull, and took it with them when they left. Nothing was ever taken from the apartments. No messages were left. The killer never lingered after doing their strange deed. We called him a killer, but the victims were usually still alive when he left. They died from blood loss afterwards, sometimes living for hours, lying there as they watched their life leak away and screamed wetly. The last one was a store owner, well liked in the community too. The one before that was an 80-year-old grandmother. Before that, it was a 19-year-old girl who was popular with the boys in the neighborhood. A bike messenger, a beat cop, an aspiring actress, a high school student who was once a beauty queen. None of these people had even known each other. There was no connection between them except for where they lived, and no one could find a single person that any of them knew in common. The only connection seemed to be that they were all well liked. I had been sent home that night, Captain telling me that I looked like crap and I needed to sleep in a real bed. My wife had been waiting for me. Captain Weems may have called her before I left, and the night had been a good one. She had saved me some dinner, roast, potatoes, things I liked, and we had cuddled on the couch as we watched something on Netflix. As tired as I was, I remember feeling warm just the same as I spent the night with her. When she looked up at me, her head pillowed in my lap, I remember thinking I was the luckiest guy in the world. When I fell asleep after a rather heated session of lovemaking, I found myself looking forward to the next day, hoping that we could catch this guy and get rid of some of the fear that was hanging around like a cloud. When I came awake, it was because of the scraping noise. Some nights, I wish I had just stayed asleep. I lay awake for a few seconds, listening to the scraping sound and wondering what it could be. It was such an alien noise, like a nail dragged across a window. There was an underlying sound as well, a low, muffled sound, like someone having a bad dream. I rolled on my side, thinking my wife was having a nightmare or something, and wanting to comfort her. She was prone to nightmares. Her childhood had been less than ideal, and I wanted to wrap her in my reassuring arms. I found myself unable to move, though. My whole body was heavy, my muscles unresponsive, and all I could do was lie there and listen to her soft groans and husky moans. I was trying to move, but this was different than the usual sleep paralysis somehow. This felt like being out of my body, unable to control it. Then my eyes tracked to the mirror that sat atop my wife's vanity, and I felt a scream hang in my throat like a piece of meat. I was choking on the scream as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. It was a dream. It had to be. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. This was a nightmare. Maybe I was even the one making these noises that I was hearing. This simply couldn't be happening. I was dreaming. I was nightmaring. I would wake up. This would all go away. The longer it went on, though, the more I concluded that it had to be happening. The thing reflected in the mirror was nearly 7 feet tall. It crouched in the bedroom, leaning over my wife, as it slid one long finger over her face. Its head was large, like a big gray baby doll head, with the face covered by a grotesque mask that looked plastered on. There was a spread of red around the mask's corners, and it looked stretched and frayed as it lay pancaked across the creature's face. The creature's body was gray, long and disproportionately slim, on a pair of spindly legs that disappeared below the corner of the bed. What interested me most, however, were the long gray arms that ended in pointy fingers. Fingers he was currently sliding over my wife's face. He was tracing that long finger along the same track, again and again, and I could just see a trickle of blood sliding down one of her cheeks as I watched helplessly. I could see a trench working its way through the skin, the blood beginning to run more freely as he went. His eyes, his overly expressive blue eyes, followed the finger's path as he worked, and I tried with all I had to break out of whatever held me. The too big head looked up from its work, and I realized I was shaking a bit as I watched him. His hand stretched out, impossibly long, and one of those claws came to rest in my ear. It was cold and wet, like a fish that's been plucked from a stream. Suddenly, my shuddering stopped, and I realized why I couldn't move. This thing had done something to me, had done something to my wife. I was forced to lay there and watch as he went about his work. The process was not quick. Whatever tool he had at the end of his wrist was dull indeed. He had to make the circuit for nearly an hour and a half, and my wife's muffled cries were beginning to become more pitiful. The blood was really coming down now, pooling on the bed and turning the white sheet a deep red. I saw my wife starting to shudder, thinking she might come out of it. He touched her with one of those claws, though, putting the tip in her ear, and she went still again. I was going to have to watch as he took her face off. At some point, I think I realized that. All the realizing in the world, though, wouldn't prepare me for it. Finally, after what felt like days, he pulled the finger back and bent over her. He brought both hands up, 10 scalpel fingers peeling the face I had loved so much from her too white skull. That's the other sound I'll never forget. The sound of my wife's face being peeled away sounds like nothing so much as Velcro separating. I saw it in the murky glass as it came free. For just an instant, I could see the creature's face too. It pulled off the old mask, and I realized too late that it was the face of the shopkeeper we had found a few days ago. It put the face in its mouth, and as it chewed, I could see a face like a swollen potato, its mouth like a carved jack-o'-lantern sneer. Its rubbery teeth chewed at the flesh as those eyes stared blankly into space. It had a pair of way too expressive blue eyes, and for a moment I thought they might have come from a doll. They looked at me suddenly, locked mine as I stared into the mirror. Those horrible blue eyes held my gaze for a count of 20 before it slapped the new face on with a wet chuck sound. Those eyes stared back at me through the eye holes of my wife's detached face, and the creature went out through the window without a second look. Those eyes peeking jealously out of my wife's face were the worst part, and that face haunts my dreams every night. By the time I could move, she was already dead. She came out of it before I did, though. She lay on the bed, gasping wetly and calling for me. I didn't know if she could see me. Did her eyes still work? She passed out a few times as she tried to turn her head, finally just laying in her own blood and calling for me softly. She wanted me to save her, wanted me to wake her up from this nightmare. She couldn't be dying in her own bed after having her face cut off. I began to get some feeling back in my arms as her voice trailed away. I could flex my fingers, but my arms didn't seem to want to work until after she had already slipped off. The light had begun to peek in by that time, and I fell out of bed as I scrambled for the phone. I told them everything. I told them about the creature. I told them about its long claws. I told them about the paralyzing dread. I told them how it had taken my wife's face and left out the window. Their response was to send me to a therapist, to give me time to grieve, to have me work with a hypnotherapist, to try to decide if I had actually seen something. I quickly learned that they didn't want to believe what I had seen. They wanted to believe that I had created this monster from my trauma. They wanted me to believe it too, but I wouldn't. I suffered through the bereavement period. I went to the therapists and told them what they wanted to hear. They wanted to tell me that the creature was a way for my mind to cope with what had happened. I knew better, though. I used that downtime to gain information about the creature. There wasn't much to go on. The crimes had all been committed within 2 blocks of each other, all in a central location, all in the part of town that housed several large apartment complexes. I asked around, seeing if anyone had seen anything like it, but I got very few answers. Some of the homeless people told me that they had seen something skulking about lately, but most of them were too strung out to be credible. A few of them led me to an abandoned underground station that had once been central to the area, but now stood abandoned. The homeless didn't stay there anymore, and if they did, they stayed there forever, or so they told me. After a month of bereavement, I came back with the information I had compiled. I was ready to hand it to the chief, but I returned to a very different environment. No one believed that I'd seen a monster steal my wife's face. I began to hear rumbles around the station that I was a suspect now. A 15-year officer had just laid there and watched his wife have her face taken off. Not likely. It seemed more likely that I had been out all night and come home to find her like that. It seemed more likely still that I was the killer, banking on the idea that my reputation would put me above suspicion. I didn't care. I knew what I'd seen, and I took my information straight to my boss. My boss, however, was in another camp altogether. Is this how you spend your period of mourning? I want you fresh, all this monster stuff out of your system. The others, they already think you're unhinged. The ones who don't think it, think you're the killer. You need to be careful talking about this kind of crap around here. Get back to your desk. You're on light duty until further notice. I don't want another word about this damn monster. I seethed behind my desk, already planning my next move. If it was proof they wanted, then it was proof I'd give them. I left early that morning and went to my home to prepare. I packed a bag, took my service pistol, and a shotgun from the hall closet. The little pump action fit nicely in my camp sack, as well as a rope, a flashlight, and some trail bars. I dressed warmly. The November weather was already becoming frigid after dark, and I looked back at my apartment before leaving, unsure if I'd ever see it again. I glanced at my wife's portrait on the mantel, though, and it was enough to send me on my way. This creature wouldn't be wearing her face for long. The old underground was a dilapidated relic, a toothless mouth that gaped out of the pavement. The gate was locked, but I had been told the fence was cut around the back. Some industrious vag had made a neat little hole to scurry through, and I entered the perimeter without much fuss. The sun had begun to set as I flipped on the flashlight, and it cast a red glow across the grimy tiles. The glow was gone after the second staircase, and I was plunged into true darkness. The outside had looked bad, but the inside was a ruin. The tiles had been shattered in places, light fixtures hanging from a leaky roof, and a single train stood like a hulk on a dead track. There was a constant sound of dripping water, a constant sound of scurrying feet, and it was easy to imagine that this was what Bilbo Baggins had found under the Goblin Mountain. I found myself swinging my flashlight around at every sound, my years of cool police training melting away as I descended into the station. Near the tracks, I found a handprint that looked red with dried blood. I jumped down to the tracks without a second thought, drawing my gun and looking right and left. My light fell across a fainted smear going left, light red staining the side of the train. I decided that was my direction. I moved quietly, not wanting to tip my prey off. He could have been hanging over my head for all I knew. If he lived here, he could probably see in the dark, and bringing a beacon with me would be as good as screaming down the tunnel. As I moved, I had little doubt that he knew I was here. The deeper in I went, the worse the scuttling and the skittering became. I told myself it was rats, but how sure was I of that? How sure was I that the scrabbling I heard wasn't the sound of those sharp fingers scraping across the ceiling? How sure was I that that scrabbling was the sound of those equally long toes, toes that I had never seen, gripping the pavement and moving his body along in a quiet scuttle? As I took another corner, I could swear that something big moved just out of my flashlight beam. I held it there for a count of 20 before turning away and continuing down the tunnel. The blood smears were all gone now, but I felt drawn deeper in as I took turns at random. It was almost as if I could hear my wife's voice calling me, and I had little doubt that he knew I was there now. I had even less doubt when he fell on my back, slamming my head down on the floor and sending my gun spinning out of my hand. I blacked out, and when I came to, I really wished I had died. I was laid across a metal bench somewhere deep in the tunnel. An eerie light lit the space, some kind of plant life maybe, and I found that I was paralyzed again. That was when my wife's face, a face made terrible by those two expressive eyes, loomed over me, and I'd have cringed away if I'd been able to move at all. It studied me, maybe it even recognized me, but its regard was terrible, as it came from a face I had loved so much. Her face was decomposed, rotting away as it clung to the creature's skull, and I felt something goopy fall onto my cheek as he leaned close to inspect me. I had only thought it couldn't get any worse. That was when he pressed that finger to the cleft in my chin. He began to circle, the claw digging against my skin as he slid the nail around and around and around my face. It didn't hurt at first. At first, it was little more than a discomfort, and I began to wonder how long he had been carving at my wife before I woke up. I stared at him, and he stared back, those baby blue eyes boring into me. His eyes were mesmerizing, terrifying, as they held unwaveringly still. As the minutes stretched into hours, I began to feel my face heating up. It was subtle at first, just a little warmth around my chin and forehead, but as the circling finger went round and round and round, I felt like someone was holding a lighter on my skin. I would have screamed, my flesh becoming seared, but I couldn't move, and my horror was trapped in my throat. I started to feel the blood as it slid down my cheek. First, it was just a trickle, a damp line or two, but soon it ran in rivulets. Soon I could feel my flesh parting from my skull. Soon I could feel that sizzling heat as it cut my skin, and I felt as though I might pass out. I had to. I must black out from this shock. There was no way that everyone was awake as he cut their living face from their body. It was impossible. It was sick. It was... He pulled the finger back suddenly, and I realized with real horror what was about to happen. All 10 fingers gripped my flesh, and I tried to pull away. Maybe I could still make it to a hospital. They could fix me. They could make this right. There was no way he was going to take my face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. It wasn't supposed to... He gripped my face, and I heard that same Velcro ripping as my own skin came free of my skull. Then he devoured my wife's face as I watched, and slapped my own across the gore-soaked canvas that was his lumpy head. He hooted then. Hooted and cried in a strange, unknowable language. He turned to a deeper tunnel and cried out in pure pleasure as he fulfilled whatever ritual he was performing, whatever dark spell he needed these faces for. I hoped he would let me go now. I had lost a lot of blood, but maybe I could still get some medical attention. I felt groggy, but when I heard something struggling out of the depths of the tunnel, I felt something heavy settle into my guts. What fresh hell was this? Out of the darkness, lit only by whatever phosphorescence dwelled down here, came a hulking thing that slid on long gray limbs. It was spider-like, a massive gray blob that pulled itself along on something like tentacles. Each of them ended in the same hooked fingers as the creature. It lowered its equally mushy face to the creature, taking in the face he now wore, and I heard something speak in a voice made of broken glass. "Do's it please, oo mother? Do I please, oo mother?" it cried, and that voice was full of hope and terrible longing. The gray creature leaned in, seemed to contemplate for a long moment, before it opened its shapeless mouth and whispered a single horrible word in a language like snakes crawling across my naked face. Ugly. Then it pulled itself back into the depths, and I heard the creature sobbing as it fell to its gray knees and wept. Then, suddenly I was running. My mind had set itself to autopilot, and my body and mind just couldn't take it anymore. Myself pushed against this thing and its terrible need, and my body propelled itself away before this knowledge could do my brain lasting harm. I ran and ran, blind in that lightless world, as the blood leaked down my naked face. If the creature came after me, then I never knew. If the thing that wore my face came after me, I never knew. I was running one second, the darkness pressing in all around me, and the next my world was full of light, and I was falling into oblivion. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, being told just how lucky I was to be alive. An undercover cop had followed me to the underground entrance, and had waited to question me when I came back out. When I didn't come out for several hours, he called in people to look for me. Those people had heard me screaming through the tunnels, caught sight of my faceless form in their flashlights, and caught me just before I fell. I had nearly died on the way here. I had simply lost too much blood, and my body was in some kind of shock. They had sedated me, my night terrors causing me to buck and scream, and I had spent nearly a week in the hospital bed. No one thinks I'm crazy anymore. No one thinks I'm the killer anymore. Certainly, no one believes I cut my own damn face off. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone living in the area. Get out. Leave your home, and get out. The creature has no rhyme or reason for his actions. He seeks only to gain something that I believe he will never find. I'm safe now, a faceless horror who will have to live his life with the knowledge I discovered under the city that day. But you needn't suffer my fate. Get away from the cheap side. Get away from the concrete apartments. Get as far from the city as you can, lest you be one more face for this monster to show his mother.
I met my husband when we were in college together. I was working on my bachelor's degree, helping out in the library for some needed extra cash, when I first laid eyes on him. He was not the usual sort of man I fancied, more bookish than muscly. I found him charming in his own way, and we struck up a friendship. He told me he was a writer, that he was working on a book of short stories to submit to a publishing house. I offered to read them, and from that moment on, I became his biggest fan. His stories were so visceral. He wrote not as a writer, but as a first-hand observer, and it wasn't long before his work was noticed. We were living together by then, our library friendship having blossomed into something more, and I could see how giddy he was when the letters came in from Bowding Publishing. When he read how they wanted to publish his book, I think it was the proudest moment of his life. He kept writing for Bowding, his stories finding a niche with the horror community. He also started selling his pieces to magazines and online sources, getting his name out there and becoming more recognizable. As his fame grew, however, he still jokingly called me his biggest fan. I couldn't argue with him. I genuinely loved his work. He wrote the sort of stories that were genuinely terrifying and enticed the reader to keep reading until the very end. As his stories grew in number, I found myself curious about where they all came from. My husband, we'll call him Michael, was a mild-mannered fellow who had never really experienced anything horrifying in his life. He described his childhood as benign, no broken bones or funny uncles. His family was loving and doted on him constantly. He had never been without. He had never really suffered, and I found myself very curious about where all these nightmares came from in such a beautiful mind. Then, over drinks one night, he told me. He didn't like to talk about, where he got the stories from, not when he was sober. He always said that discussing the creative process was boring, or that his story's technical aspects would bore me to tears. I wasn't fooled, though. Beneath his jokes was something colder, something fearful. So one night I pressed him. He still didn't really want to talk about it, but I persisted. Finally, after a lot of coaxing and some strong whiskey, he all but blurted his answer to me. I wish now that I hadn't asked. "It's the door," he said, and at that moment he seemed almost afraid of his own words. "The door?" I was confused by the queerness of his answer. What do you dream about?" He asked the question so suddenly I was taken by surprise. "Oh, I don't know. Normal things, I guess. What I did the day before, movies I've watched, weird things my mind cooks up. I've only ever had the same dream my entire life. It's always the same. It never changes. It's where I get all my ideas." I leaned forward, intrigued by what he was telling me. He seemed emboldened by my attention. "The door lies in space. At least I believe it must be space. It floats in a great void, and every night I visit it. I float through this void naked, an umbilicus connecting me to whatever lies beyond. Every night I approach the door, and every night it whispers to me through the keyhole. Do you remember the little journal on my bedside?" I nodded, begging him to go on with my eyes. "I've trained myself to write the things I hear while sleeping. Sometimes I see pictures or faces when I look through the keyhole. Sometimes I hear terrible words spoken by creatures I imagine to be beyond my description. Sometimes I have to close my eyes and will myself awake because I'm afraid that the things they tell me will drive me insane. When I wake up, I read what I've written down, which becomes my stories." I was shocked. "So all your stories come from this big door in space?" He smiled at me. "It sounds silly when you say it like that, but yes, everything I've ever written was spoken to me by something on the other side of that door." I didn't think anything of it the next day. We'd been drunk, and he had just spouted off something to make me shut up. I was sure of it. I became more aware of his journal, though. Sometimes at night he would wake me up with the scritch-scratch of his pen on the page. I didn't like to look at him when he was writing it. It was like something otherworldly had taken his strings and was using him without his permission. Watching him write in that fugue state made me feel uncomfortable, and I took measures not to be awake while it was going on. I didn't think anything else of this, not until about 3 months ago. That was when he started having the nightmares. His work had always been creepy, always terrifying, but now it took on an alarming quality. He began talking about creatures that lived beyond the door. These creatures sounded more than a little Lovecraftian, and he was assured that their presence on Earth was an affront to the natural order. They came and went, their arrivals marked by some with great portents, and their battles had shaped history. The stories weren't the only thing that changed, though. He began to sleep poorly. His sleep had always been placid, peaceful, but now he thrashed and mumbled in his sleep. He whimpered in the night about the pale lady or the green man and the riotous red that surged like blood. The words he wrote in his journal were unreadable, a foreign language, but he sat and scribbled them, transcribed them every morning like a dutiful follower of some religion. He began to change. His eyes bore huge bags. He was jumpy and unsure of himself, and more than once I caught him catnapping fitfully during the day. His writing, however, was more in demand than ever. The magazines he wrote for wanted more stories about these strange old ones. His editor wanted to publish a compilation of them at once. He had no lack of material for the book, but I began to get worried about his health as he proceeded. We had been married for 2 years then, just starting to make a life together, and I was afraid that his candle would burn out before mine. I asked him one night to stop writing the stories. He was at his computer, typing away dutifully, when I made the request. He turned his head to look at me, haunted eyes boring into mine, and laughed for the first time in weeks. It wasn't his laugh, though. The laughter was jagged and full of despair, humor shared only by the damned. He laughed like a madman. "I can't. If I stop writing, they won't like it." "Who?" I asked in confusion. The ones behind the door. They've marked me as their chronicler. I can't stop until the job is done. These things are killing you. Can't you see that, Michael?" He slumped over his keyboard, resting his head against it, making a line of letters as he did so. Don't you think I would if I could? If I could stop, I would give so much to stop. The things they tell me, no one should have to know these things. It's fruit from the poison tree, and I wish I did not have the knowledge that they've given me. Then stop, I said suddenly. Just stop writing. Tell them you refuse to write their story. He looked horrified. Refuse them? I've never refused a story before. What if it stops the door from working? I turned him in his chair and pulled him to me. The door is in your mind, love. The way it manifests is nothing more than your own mind working through your stories. The monsters are of your own making. You control them. They don't control you. At that moment, he looked relieved. He hugged me back and seemed on the verge of tears. I don't think he had ever thought of those nightly excursions as anything but in a literal sense. He had never imagined that these things could be of his own creation, and the knowledge had made him feel free. I'll tell them tonight then, he said with a smile on his face. I'll tell them that I don't want to write about them anymore. I'll tell Fred that I don't want to continue these stories in the morning. He won't like it, but he'll understand. He went to bed then, and I figured that would be the end of the nightmares. I was wrong. He woke me in the middle of the night screaming. The back of his hands hit me in the face, and I rolled awake to the sound of him screaming. He was thrashing around, clutching his stomach and kicking his legs frantically. I tried to wake him. I know everything says not to do that, but I wanted him to wake up. I slapped his face. I threw water on him. I screamed his name, but nothing worked. Someone banged on the door, but I ignored them. I tried in every way I could to help my husband. Finally, he helped himself. We were in the ER. The knocking person had called the paramedics, and they had burst in. They thought someone was being murdered, but they loaded him up and took him straight to the hospital when they saw what was going on. He lay in an ER bed, screaming and kicking until they finally restrained him. He went right on thrashing and yelling until nearly 4 a.m. Then he gasped loudly, like a diver coming up from a deep depth, and seemed to come awake. "They cut my umbilicus," he said in a tone of the most profound sorrow. They moved him upstairs later that day. The doctor who talked to him was afraid that he might hurt himself, and I was a little worried too. For the next 2 days, he sat strapped to a hospital bed, fighting sleep. He couldn't sleep, he told me, because he would have no way back without his umbilicus. I would be lost forever, and my consciousness would float forever in that void. He told me how he had told the thing behind the door that he would no longer write its story. I had assured him that it was all in his head, that it was a product of his imagination. When it had burst through the door and screamed, he knew it was all too real. He had run then, fled across the void, but the creature had wings and it had chased him. It defies description. Its legs were equine, its head like living rock. Its body was made of stars. I don't know, dear. Its mouth was full of fiery teeth, and when it lunged at me, I could do nothing but flee. As he had run, the thing had slashed at him. The clawed hand had torn at his umbilicus. Michael said a pain like a rending scythe had torn through his belly, and as he writhed, he could see the fiery teeth sever the root from him. He had caught the end then, using the last of his strength to grab the trailing end, and pulled himself out of the dark place, a little at a time. He was afraid after that, afraid to go back, afraid of what might be waiting there for him. He fought sleep for the next 3 days. He would nod and awaken, but it seemed harder for him to come back every time. He begged his doctor for caffeine pills, for coffee, for anything to keep him awake, but the doctors thought sleep would be the best drug for him. They fiddled with the idea of sedating him, but I forbade it. When they threatened to get the police involved, thinking I was somehow responsible for this, I threatened to call a lawyer. Finally, we reached a shaky standoff. It was moot after day 3. I lost the fight first, drifting off as I sat by his bedside. When I awoke, he was gone. He's in the ICU now. His coma is deep, and the doctors are afraid he might have suffered a stroke. They don't know about his nightly travels. wouldn't believe me if I told them, but I know what's been happening to him. He's adrift in the void now, maybe already dead at the hands of this elder thing, and there's nothing I can do to get him back. But maybe there is something you all can do. My husband could not be the only one traveling to this place. Some of you must have heard the whispers through the door as well. If you see this door, and if you find my husband, please bring him back. I don't know how you would, but please try. And if the creatures on the other side of the door talk to you about things from the other side, please do yourself a favor and listen to them. Don't ever stop listening to them. I wish I had never told him to stop listening. The price you pay for ignoring them might be your life. The price might even be steeper than that.
It's something I'd heard my whole life, though it's never been this clear. If I make this shot, the world lives. As a kid, it would rustle across my brain like a flock of birds. Sometimes if I was thinking hard about something, and sometimes when I was just being quiet and trying to focus. It was never distracting, never something that tore me away from my day-to-day life, and in fact, it made me feel safe. It wasn't even in my voice, not any voice I was familiar with. They say that when you talk to yourself, and your internal voice talks back to you, it's still your voice. This voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. My whole life, it sounded like the same childish trill. As I got older and started going to church, I started to think it might be something different. I noticed that the voice always came before something good, giving me the confidence to try things I wouldn't normally do. I'd hear the voice just before a test, or right before I stepped up to bat, and I'd know that everything was about to turn out great. The more it happened, the more I became convinced that I was special. The longer it went on, the more I thought I was hearing the voice of God. I told my priest about it, my family being very Catholic, and he said it sounded like I had a close relationship with God. Even at 8 years old, I could tell that he didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I was hearing, and I knew it was important. The more it pushed me towards success, the more I started saying it to myself like a mantra. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I went on stage for a debate. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I took a test. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I hit a ball, or threw a basketball, or did anything I wanted to succeed at. And if I heard the voice say it back, then I'd know that I was about to do great things. It's what pushed me into the priesthood, and pushed me to my ultimate act of blasphemy. That's not the right word, but it's the best I can think of. It had been 30 years since I'd first heard that voice, and I was now a young priest with a church of my own. I had built a reputation with the other priests for writing sermons that kept parishioners in their seats and having a lot of luck regarding matters with the diocese. I'd gotten through the ranks faster than most, doing very well on my tests of catechism and church doctrine. At this rate, I was on my way to becoming one of the youngest bishops in my area. I had never told any of them about the voices, thinking it was similar to the way people in the Bible had heard the voice of God once upon a time. I knew it wasn't okay for me to think of myself as a prophet, but whatever the reason, I was still certain that it was the voice of God. I should have been pleased, but I found myself thinking more and more about the nature of the phrase. I'd hear it before sermons sometimes, and know that today's reflection on the Lord's words would be particularly captivating. I still said it to myself before doing anything, and I realized that it'd become kind of a lucky charm to me. Things would go well, and I would attribute it to the mantra. But why did I make this leap? Because it had always been? I needed to be sure. So I started doing research. Luckily, or unluckily, the Catholic Church has a lot of resources for those looking to research the nature of religion. There was a lot of information on prophets, others who had communicated with God and his messengers, but my own situation was unique,
I heard the same phrase again and again, and if it was the voice of God, then it was the first for such repetition. God told his prophets and chosen mouthpieces what he wanted them to do. Go to Nineveh, free the Hebrews, sacrifice your son. Whatever he was asking people to do, he was always very specific. If I make this shot, the world will live was not particularly specific, though. I don't want any of you reading this to think that I went in only from a position of faith. I started by having a checkup with Dr. Redman, my family physician. He ran a series of tests to determine if I had any underlying conditions, perhaps a tumor or some undiagnosed schizophrenia. It would have been easier if it was just something I could chalk up to external stimuli, but Dr. Redman told me I was healthy as a horse when the results came back. EKG, EEG, X-ray, physical, CT scan, heck, you even passed the cardiac battery with flying colors. I hope the Vatican has deep pockets, because I'd imagine you just broke your healthcare budget for the year. I thanked him, figuring the church could foot the bill for my upcoming research. With the tests showing that I was in the right state of mind with a sound body, I started studying ways to instigate a more receptive state. There were several accounts of priests fasting and praying so they could speak with God, and while the idea of starving myself didn't appeal to me, it seemed to be the best way to find out more about the voice. It had never changed through the years, still sounding youngish with the first rumblings of depth, and I wanted to know if the phrase had some deeper meaning. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but if he had some job for me, I needed to disseminate what it was. I told my aides what I meant to do, giving them special instructions not to bother me, but to check on me periodically. If they found me passed out or unconscious, they had specific instructions to offer aid. If I was hurting myself, worse than depriving myself of sleep and food I meant, they were to call the hospital and have me admitted. As long as I was still praying or meditating or not doing myself any harm, they would leave me to it. I planned to conduct my little experiment from Sunday night to Saturday night of the following week, and on the following Sunday, I would come to Mass with something to talk about for my weekly sermon. I had no idea how prophetic that statement would be. So, after Mass on Sunday night, I locked myself in my study, ate my last meal for the week, and began to read. I started at the beginning, reading of creation and of the garden, and as the hours stretched on, I began to read aloud to keep myself awake. The first night was easily the hardest. My body cried out for sleep as my stomach grumbled for lack of food. By the time Brother Joseph had come to check on me the next morning, I was past the worst of it and still reciting the book of Numbers. He left me water, asking me how I felt before leaving me to it. This was the height of my excitement for the project. I'd only been awake for about a day, and my zeal was still running high. I had heard the words 3 or 4 times throughout the night, and they had been clearer than they had ever been before. Sometimes the words were muffled, sounding like a kid's tin can phone, but that night the words were crisp and clear. I read for the rest of the day, hearing them 2 more times, and as night settled in, I felt tired, but still with hope and God's love. By day 3, some of my enthusiasm was starting to slip. I'd heard the words a few more times, twice perhaps, but I was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. My stomach was also in a knot, and my head was swimming as my blood sugar fluctuated wildly. I had read stories about men fasting for weeks at a time, and I couldn't imagine another day of this. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that, the few times I'd heard it, the voice had been clear as a bell. Thursday night found me doing laps in my study, when I finally got my answer. I had finished the Bible Wednesday night, and had moved on to the Contemplations of Dogma by Cardinal Mansfield. I had thought about praying, but it was tempting to sleep if I wasn't walking. I had been awake for 4 days now, and my desire to rest was almost as invasive as my desire to eat. I was dizzy as I read, the words running together, and as a stomach cramp hit me, I saw the book tumble from my hands as I doubled over. I thought I might throw up the water I had drunk a few hours ago, but instead I continued forward and fell to the floor. I landed next to the book, my world going black as I fell over, and I wasn't sure if I was going to wake up. If I make this shot, the world lives. I could hear the voice as if someone were whispering it into my ear. I opened my eyes and was suddenly aware of floating. I was hovering over the shoulder of a young giant, his face that of a high school or college student. He was writing an essay, his pencil scratching on the page as he toiled away at his work. He would stop and erase something before starting again, and as I moved closer, I could see that he had a small stack of finished papers beside him on the desk. How long he'd been writing on this essay was anyone's guess, but with an angry growl, I watched him crumble up the page before turning in his chair to face me. If I make this shot, the world lives. With a smooth and practiced arc, I watched him toss the paper into a nearby garbage pail before returning to his work, his pencil scratching away as he wrote. I was speechless. What was I seeing here? Was this God? It couldn't be. Could it? As he furrowed his brow, I saw that this essay wasn't the only thing on his desk. There was a manuscript, too, the title page proclaiming it to be Golden Fields. I began to understand why I had heard him say the mantra so many times. I assumed it was part of his process, and the throwing away of ideas was as much a part of it as writing itself. If I were to read that manuscript, I wondered, would I find a priest in it? Perhaps one who hears voices? Was this man my creator? My God? The architect of everything that I knew and loved? I came to in the emergency room, Brother Marcus having found me seizing on the floor and called an ambulance. Now I lie here, contemplating what I saw. Was it real? Did I actually see these things? Did I actually see this being, or was it something my mind created? As I sit here, I can still hear the words from time to time, but I don't say them anymore. The church has given me a short leave of absence, but I don't know if I can ever go back to my old life. How can I preach of God and glory while I know in my heart that we exist because of a single being and his ability to throw a paper ball into a hoop? It makes me realize how insubstantial we are, how little we matter. But that's not the worst thing that has occurred to me while I lay here. As I sit and listen to the listless beeps of the machine, I find my mind circling back to the same question again and again. If he should miss his next shot, what would happen? Would we ever know? If he missed his next shot, would we continue to live, or simply snuff out into non-existence? Susan smiled as she watched Gus paw at his reflection in the mirror. "Did you find another cat to play with?" she asked, and Gus looked back with a meow before pawing at his reflection again. She was glad that Gus had found someone to play with, even if it was just his reflection. Gus had been depressed lately. They say that having only one cat could lead to this sort of thing. Cats are social animals, after all. Gus couldn't really play with any of the strays outside Susan's apartment, because she was on the 3rd floor, and a little out of reach for even the most nimble of the wandering felines. That didn't stop Gus from standing on her balcony, though, meowing at the cats below and trying to get their attention. Susan thought it was kind of sad, watching him paw at the screen as he called down to the cats who lived their lives in blissful freedom. But the apartment contract had been very clear on their one pet per unit policy, and Susan didn't want to move just so Gus could have a playmate. Gus was a big orange tomcat that Susan had found wandering near her parents' house before she moved out. He'd been a scrawny little kitten when she'd found him, and she had fallen in love with him almost instantly. Susan had just gone through a bad breakup when she had stumbled across the sad little kitten near the garbage cans one morning. The little fuzzball had helped her get through her loneliness, and she liked to think that she had helped him as well. When she moved out of her parents' house at the end of the year, Susan had taken the little cat with her. She and Gus had been roommates ever since. Gus was a great companion, and didn't seem prone to the midnight zoomies or the sometimes destructive behavior her friends complained about in their cats. Gus liked a scratching post, snuggling in bed with Susan until it was time for her to get up, and eating his own food instead of hers. His only real issue seemed to be his loneliness, and Susan could hardly hold that against him. Watching him play with his reflection in the mirror was as cute as it was sad, like a kid playing with his imaginary friend because he couldn't seem to make any real ones.
Susan watched him as she got ready for work, and she pulled out her phone as she took some video for Instagram. The scrawny little kitten had grown into a regal orange ball of fur, and to watch him paw at the surface of the mirror was insanely cute. He would cock his head and meow at his reflection sometimes, looking confused at the cat in the mirror, before going back to pawing at the glass. Susan smiled, but there was something just a little off-putting about that confused head turn now and then. She left him staring at himself in the mirror, his game forgotten, as he seemed to be talking to the orange cat in the mirror. Susan came home to find him still sitting in front of the mirror. She asked him if he'd been there all day, and Gus just looked back and meowed before looking back at the mirror again. He was staring at himself, his ears moving back and forth, seeming to Susan like he was having a conversation with his reflection. Growing up with cats, she had seen them sit next to each other and do just that same thing, and Gus's eye contact was more than a little interesting as he watched himself in the mirror. She tried to ignore him as she slid into her PJs, but it was hard the longer it went on. "Come on, Gus, want to watch a movie with me?" she said, patting the bed as she fiddled with the TV. Gus looked up, meowing happily, but then turned back to the mirror and did an oddly unsure little head cock as he took a few steps towards the bed. In the end, Susan had to come get him and take him over to the bed, as the poor old Tom watched the mirror. Susan saw nothing out of the ordinary, the mirror cat just scooped up by her own mirror reflection, but this behavior was wandering into the realm of creepy rather than cute. Gus sat with her happily as Susan watched Friends for the 1000th time, but she caught him glancing back at the mirror more than once as she stroked his silky fur. He wasn't the only one. Susan couldn't help but glancing at it as well, looking at the mirror as if she expected to see something out of the ordinary. She didn't, but it was definitely starting to creep her out. Susan let her keys fall into the bowl by the door, calling for Gus as she slid her shoes off. It had been such a long day. A creepy old man had hit on her at work, the customers were rude, and Susan sometimes wondered why she didn't just quit. She could do better than an assistant manager at a grocery store, and she knew it. If it hadn't been for Gus in this apartment, she'd have likely walked away a while ago. Speaking of Gus, where the heck was he? He almost always came to greet her at the door. She called him again, but there was no response. She went to the bedroom and huffed out in mock outrage when she saw him sitting in front of the mirror again. "Okay, Furface, this is getting to be a little much. It was cute at first, but now it's super creepy." He meowed pitifully when she picked him up, pawing gently as he tried to get away, but she took him over to the bed and sat down with him. He watched her dutifully as she got changed, his fluffy head turning back to the mirror from time to time as Susan slid into her pajamas. And she couldn't help but glancing at it as well. She wasn't sure, but felt like she could see something moving there when she wasn't giving it her full attention. The mirror was the large rolling kind that the apartments often came with, the one on the closet doors. You could see the whole room in it, and it slid to the side on tracks if you needed something out of the closet. It was a nice amenity to have when you were getting ready in the morning, but it was starting to creep Susan out the longer she looked at it. She got that spidery feeling as she put her back to it like something was watching her. When she pulled her hair into a ponytail and turned to put it up, she almost dropped her scrunchie. Gus was staring at her, head cocked, as he watched her from the front of the mirror. She stepped back, startled, and when her legs bumped against the chair in front of the vanity, she sat down hard. Something came off the bed then, and she heard Gus meowing as he looked at her as if to ask if she was okay. Susan looked back at the mirror and saw that it was empty again, save for her own surprised face and the furry reflection of Gus as he stood by her leg. That night was the first time she covered the mirror. She took some thumbtacks and an old throw blanket and used them to cover the surface. It was silly. She knew it was silly. But she felt better when the mirror's surface wasn't looking at her anymore. Gus walked over to inspect her work, and Susan picked him up as he began to paw at the blanket. Gus would just have to get over it, she thought, and she took him to bed and put something on to distract her and her fears. As she scratched his ears, she felt better, and as the night went on, she almost forgot all about her silly fears from earlier. When she woke up, though, she saw that the blanket had been pulled down, and Gus was again talking to himself. This became a daily routine for her. The first thing she did when she got up or got home from work was to cover the mirror and tell Gus to stop pulling the blanket down. Gus would meow when she did this, looking at the blanket and pawing at the covered surface of the mirror, but Susan was unmoving in her decision to keep the blanket up. She would usually pick Gus up as he pawed pathetically at the blanket and take him off to pet him, but it never stopped him from coming back to it. It never stopped him from uncovering it again, and Susan just accepted that this was Gus's new obsession. The cuts on her big fur ball were a little harder to ignore, though. Sometimes, while stroking his silky fur, Susan would encounter a scratch or a bite and wonder how exactly he had gotten it. They weren't the sort of wounds a cat could get from just scratching themselves. At least she didn't think they were. When she noticed a bite on the tip of his ear one afternoon, she actually searched the house to see if another cat might have gotten in somehow. His food bowl never emptied any quicker than usual, and there was never any extra scat in the box. If there was some secret cat living in the house, it was extremely quiet when she was there. The only strange thing was Gus's melancholy seemed to have disappeared. His mood had improved, and he spent less time meowing to the cats below the balcony. The only change was that she had to shoo him away from the mirror constantly. If he wasn't in her lap being petted, Gus was at the mirror or at the blanket that covered it. He never took it down while she was there, but he would put his face underneath it or just stare at it like he could hear someone talking. Susan found this extremely off-putting, but what could she do? The mirror was attached to the closet door, and without it, Gus would be free to leave his long orange fur all over her clothes that she had hanging in there. Also, as much as it creeped her out, she couldn't stand to think of Gus being sad again while she was at work. Then, one day, something changed. She came home to find the blanket down and Gus looking at himself as he always did. "Seriously, Gus? This is getting annoying. I hate having to put this blanket back up every..." But she stopped when Gus turned his amber eyes to stare at her. The two held their gaze for a few moments, but Susan couldn't help but hear the voice of her subconscious as it screamed that this wasn't her cat. It looked like Gus, it sat like Gus, and was a perfectly adorable little ball of orange fluff, but his eyes were different. They were the same amber gold they had always been, but today they were filled with hate. No, not hate, Susan supposed. It was something else, like a king looking at a mud-covered serf. Not with pity, and certainly not with any desire to help it. Gus looked at her with scorn and something akin to disgust. How exactly a cat could portray these things with its fuzzy little face, Susan didn't know, but that's what it was. Gus loathed her. She suddenly caught him by the scruff, and when he hissed at her, Susan realized it was the first time she'd heard him do that. He swiped a fat ginger paw at her, and Susan almost dropped him as his claws sliced her wrist. Gus growled and cried in his angry little voice, a voice that was suddenly less cute than usual, and Susan tossed him into the hall and closed the door. Gus bumped at it, hissing and yowling, and Susan was surprised when she realized that her back was against the door. It was like she thought he might just come through the door. She locked it just in case and walked into her bathroom as she washed the cut with soap and water. It wasn't very deep, but the 3 long scratches had been right across her wrist. She had just finished putting some Bactine on it and looking for a Band-Aid when she heard Gus's pitiful meow from the other room. That sounded more like the lovable fluff Susan knew, so she slapped the Band-Aid on and went to open the bedroom door. Perhaps she had just startled him as he had startled her. She hadn't grabbed him by the scruff of the neck since he was a kitten, and he was quite a bit heavier now. Susan suddenly wondered if maybe she had hurt him, and she opened the door as she prepared to pull him into a hug. "Sorry, Gus, you just scared me. I wasn't..." But she opened the door and noticed that he wasn't there. She checked the hallway, but Gus was nowhere to be found. Susan shrugged, tallying it up to strange cat behavior, and finished doctoring her arm before going to start dinner. As she cooked, she kept expecting to see Gus come out and sniff or rub up against her leg. Gus was always so curious, and he always came to have a look when she was cooking or watching TV. He had even jumped into the shower with her a few times, though he always instantly regretted it. She began to feel guilty about what had happened earlier and just wanted to find him so she could pet him and say she was sorry. Even so, those weird eyes kept coming back to her. She couldn't shake the idea that that cat hadn't been her Gus. She didn't see him again until she was cleaning up and getting ready to take the garbage out. Susan was in a bit of a hurry as she tied the bag up and started pulling it out of the can. The plastic pan the chicken had come in had likely leaked into the bottom of the bag, and she wanted to get it to the dumpster before it dripped onto the floor. She hadn't seen Gus since she'd put him out, not even as she ate chicken Alfredo on the couch. He was likely still sulking somewhere, but she figured he'd come out when it was time for bed, and all would be forgiven by tomorrow. She thought she might have heard him, though, and he sounded upset wherever he was. Susan had cocked an ear several times as she cooked, listening to the meows of a familiar cat from the back of the house. She had called him, even taken the tuna he liked to coax him out, but he had never poked his head out or shown any interest in any of it. Susan had looked all over for him a few times, but as the sound of her sauce bubbling began to sound more like burning, she always returned to the stove. She walked to the door with her swinging bag of trash, and when the door came open with a loud creak, she heard claws scrabbling on linoleum. Susan saw an orange lightning bolt come barreling out from behind the china cabinet and make a break for the open door. She moved purely by chance, and Gus hit the trash bag as he yowled and smacked against the cans and packages inside. Susan dropped the bag, no longer mindful of the chicken drippings, and reached for Gus before he could escape. He had never tried to run away before, not even as a half-starved little kitten, and when her hands settled around him, he yowled and slashed at her furiously. He clawed at her hands, swiped at her face, and Susan stepped back when one paw scored her across the cheek and thought about the garbage a little too late. Whether it was the chicken leavings or some other liquid, Susan felt her feet shoot out from under her as she fell against the china cabinet. Her head smacked against the bulky old thing, and everything went fuzzy as she watched Gus run off into the night. She called his name distantly before passing out and waking up somewhere very different. Susan woke up in the hospital. Her mom was reading a magazine, but as Susan groaned, she called for the nurse and leaned in to have a look at her. The nurse came on the run, and Susan was soon poked and prodded and examined by her mother and several people in scrubs. She was confused and a little scared, and when she asked what had happened, it took her dad coming in from the cafeteria to shed any light on the situation. The complex had called her parents, since they were her emergency contact, to let them know that a neighbor had found her passed out in her doorway. They had called an ambulance, and she had been rushed to the ER with a head wound. She had spent 3 days unconscious, her concussion pretty substantial, and her parents had been worried sick. She asked her dad if he'd been to the apartment and if he'd seen Gus, but he said he hadn't done much more than put some food in a bowl and lock the place up. "He's probably okay, sweetie. Cats are pretty self-reliant. I'll go back tonight and make sure he has food and water, though." They wanted to keep her at the hospital until they were sure that she was okay, but Susan was adamant that she needed to leave. Gus had gotten out, and she needed to find him. He had been scared by the garbage bag and startled when she grabbed him. He hadn't meant to scratch her. He was probably cold and scared and waiting for her to come home, and she started to cry when they told her it would be a few more days before she was released. Her dad didn't help matters much. He checked on Gus, but said that he must have gotten out. His food bowl was still full, and he hadn't come home when her dad had called him. He had looked around, but he hadn't seen any sign of him. "I'm sure he's just scared and waiting for you to come back. He'll probably meet you at the door when you come home from the hospital," he assured her, his face showing a lot of worry. She came home 3 days later, after the hospital had run every test they could think of, and Susan was greeted by nothing but a plain beige door and a note from her neighbor wishing her a speedy recovery. She opened the front door thinking maybe he would be there, but the house was cold and empty. It felt lonely without Gus there to welcome her, and she decided then that she had to go look for him. Maybe he was close by, playing with the cats he had seen from the balcony. She would get some treats and call him, and hopefully he would come back after some coaxing, and they could be a family again. She was halfway down the hallway when she recognized a pitiful meow from her bedroom. She came through the door looking frantically for Gus. Had he gotten stuck in the bedroom? How had he been eating and drinking this whole week? She expected that he would come pelting out when the door opened, but he was nowhere to be found. She started looking for him under the bed and in the closet, but when the same sad meow came from behind her, she turned and found the source. It was Gus. He was just as fluffy as she remembered him, and it broke her heart to see how thin he looked under all that fur. He looked troubled, his eyes darting around as he put a paw up and pleaded for her to help him. He looked sorry, like he would do anything if she could just help him out of this. And as she approached him, Susan could feel her tears coming down in a torrent. Gus pressed his paw against the mirror. His toes were visible from the other side, and as he pressed and shoved, she could see he was becoming upset. Gus was stuck inside the mirror, his world nothing more than a little room, the one he had loved so much. Susan put a hand up to the mirror, covering his little paw with hers, and only then noticed that she didn't have a reflection. She sat and wondered if she'd have to watch her poor cat Gus waste away, unable to help him, and she laid her forehead against the glass as she cried all the harder.
Driving is easily the most boring part of my job. I work as a salesman for an all-in-one printer company. Business has been slow the last couple of years, with the rise of personal printers, but our loyal customer base has really helped us get through these troubling times. That's why I was in Garrison and Marco's attorney at law that day. I'd been trying to sell them on the latest color all-in-one model to replace their current one, which was a few years old. They had sent me back to the office with a "we'll think about it," and I had started my 4-hour drive back to said office. That's how I came to be on the highway behind the truck in the first place. The sun was setting when I left the law firm. By the time I got on the highway, it was already dark. I mingled with the other cars as we merged in with the big rigs that made the interstate their home. I was behind a particularly large 18-wheeler when I first noticed the thing. It started out as a reflection. Have you ever noticed how an animal's eyes will reflect the light? Well, it was like that. I was sitting behind him with my low beams on when I noticed the sparkle from underneath the trailer. It was 3 or 4 small reflective points, and in my mind, I sort of obsessed over it. What could possibly be making those reflections? Some sort of axle? Maybe something ornamental that the driver had stuck under this truck. It probably seems silly to obsess over something like that as you sit reading my story. But when you're stuck in traffic on the interstate, your mind searches for all sorts of things to occupy your time. Whatever it was midway between the front wheels and the back wheels, too far into the truck for me to really make it out. I didn't think it was alive or anything, but it was a fun little mystery. I was stuck in gridlock. Some wreck up the way had brought us to a halt, and as I adjusted the radio in the beat-up old car that gave the salesman a drive, I found my eyes returning to that thing again and again. My brain just wouldn't leave it alone, and I began to create reasons for the thing to be under there. Maybe it was for stability. Maybe it was something he had put under there so people didn't hit the back of the trailer in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just one of those stupid things that people often hook to their trucks just because they can. Whatever it was, my mind had decided to obsess over it. I was watching it when my cell phone rang, and as I fished it out of my pocket, I found my eyes rising to see the thing as I said hello. "So, can we go ahead and put them down for a new printer?" the boss asked. They said they'd have to think about it, but they also said there's nothing wrong with their current printer, so I wouldn't expect to see any orders from them. Damn, I was really counting on offloading a couple of these to the firm. Did you tell them about the added features? Of course I did, sir. And I was about to tell him that I was no rookie salesman when I looked up and almost dropped the phone. The thing I had been focused on for the last 20 miles had moved. It was subtle, but when you've been staring at it for as long as I had, you notice these things. The thin fiber filament had shifted somehow, and the pattern had changed. I was almost sure of it. I could hear my boss asking if I was still there, and I assured him that I was. I told him I would be back in the office in a few hours, and he told me just to head home. I could turn in my reports tomorrow. Sounds like you could use the sleep. You're sounding a little jittery. I thanked him and told him I'd see him tomorrow, before hanging up the phone and looking back at the thing under the truck. I could also see 6 surfaces reflected back at me now, instead of the 4 I had seen a moment ago. They looked even more like eyes. Whatever wreck there was up ahead, they must have cleared it out of the way. We were suddenly moving along again at a brisk pace, and I was glad for the shift in speed. My mind had suddenly turned what looked like some kind of ornament into something dangerous, and I really wanted to be from behind this truck. There was no chance of getting around them, though. The traffic was still pretty tight, and I was pretty well trapped behind this 18-wheeler and the 18-wheeler beside me. So for the next 2 hours we drove, the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. The longer we drove, the more I was convinced that it was no optical illusion. Whatever was under there was definitely moving, and it had quite a few legs that I could see. It was using 2 of the thinner ones to hold itself under the truck, and the other 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10, were anchoring it to the truck itself. What was worse were all those reflective surfaces that I still thought of as eyes. They were staring straight at me the whole time, and I began to believe that it knew I could see it. I shook my head the first time I thought this. I was tired, I had had too much coffee, and I was just seeing things. These were the excuses that ran around and around inside my head, like a dog chasing his tail. I didn't want to believe that I was stuck behind a truck, carrying a very different sort of cargo. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, and I was making things up to pass the time. That sort of delusion only lasted until the thing moved closer. You see, the longer I watched it, the longer it watched me. I don't know if it knew I could see it, but it didn't seem to like the level of scrutiny I was giving it. It was midway between the cab, watching me like a predator watching its prey. The longer it went on, the less safe I felt inside my car. Something that big could surely get through the window, or break the windshield, and I would have nowhere to go in this gridlock. But I was still trying to be rational, trying to be realistic. There was no way that whatever it was alive. It was a trick of the light. It was my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally got home, safe behind the door of my apartment, I would laugh about how silly I had been, and feel really stupid. I was a grown man behind the wheel of a car, jumping at shadows. I began to use this idea as a security blanket, wrapping myself in it so I didn't just go crazy right there behind the wheel of my car. That was when it moved. The reflective eyes shifted suddenly. I don't mean that they blinked or anything. I mean they shifted. One minute I was looking at it, and the next it was sliding beneath the underside of the trailer. Suddenly those eyes were coming closer. They were less than 10 feet away from my car now, peering from under the trailer at me as I tried to maintain my speed. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. Whatever it was had finally gotten tired of being watched, and had decided to get closer. I felt a sudden stirring of primal fear. This must have been how early man had felt when it encountered something it just didn't understand. When it saw the long teeth and heard the growl of some unknown predator. When it saw the all-too-intelligent eyes of an animal that was a little too human reflected in the darkness. When it came to realize that the safety of its cave could also be a trap. I imagine that it felt just as helpless as I did now. Helpless, but intent on survival. I tried again to convince myself that I was being silly. This was nothing more than a trick of the light. Some errant spiderweb under the cab that my headlights were catching that just now came loose and was presenting itself as some sort of boogeyman for me to be afraid of. I suddenly knew how to alleviate this fear. I would flip my high beams on. The high beams would show me the underside of the truck, and I could see that the source of my fears was nothing at all. I reached for the switch, my hands much less steady than I thought they should be, my fingers wrapping around the knob. For a moment, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the switch. Did I really want to know? Did I really want this thing to know that I knew? Once the monster in the closet knows that you know it's there, does it have any choice but to eat you? I shook my head and flipped the switch on. I know now that I shouldn't have done that. What was under the cab was no spider web, but it was the monster I had feared it was. It was a spider the size of a large dog. It was easily 4.5 feet tall, and it was hunkered beneath the trailer's cluster of wheels. It looked at me upside down, with its legs clinging to the metal, its fangs dripping some translucent liquid and clicking together very fast. It made a high, angry sound that I could hear from behind my closed windows, and the look it gave me on its far too expressive face was terrifying. My brain seemed to give me a choice between fight or flight, and in my cowardice, I chose flight. I pulled around the truck, pulling onto the soft shoulder of the road, and drove around it and the line of angry cars. Fortunately, there were no police officers in that line. There was an exit ramp not too terribly far from the truck, and I whipped into the on-ramp and pulled away from the highway into the small gas station about a mile later. It took me nearly 30 minutes to make my breath regular, expecting that spider creature to attack my car any minute. When I had control of myself again, I drove home. It took an extra hour, but I took side roads and back ways the whole way. So often in these stories, there's a moment of horror that comes afterward. Some accident, a truck found abandoned on the side of the road, a dead body in the truck stop, but there was none of that for me. I never heard a news report alluding to anything strange or out of the ordinary. I could almost forget about it until I close my eyes and see those far too expressive eyes looking at me as the high beams pin it to the underside and their lights. I take back roads whenever I travel now, avoiding the highway at all costs. I avoid big rigs as well. I don't ever want to see anything like that again.